They said I disappeared. My uncle made sure of it. What nobody knew, what he never counted on, was that I was still listening. I was 23 when my grandfather got sick, not the slow kind of sick that gives a family time to prepare. The fast kind. The kind where one Tuesday he's complaining about the coffee being too weak, and by Thursday he's in a hospital bed with tubes in his arm and a look in his eyes like he already knows how the story ends. My grandfather, the man who taught me to drive in an empty church parking lot, who kept a photo of my grandmother in his shirt pocket every single day after she passed. That man was dying, and I flew home from Portland the same night my aunt called me. My uncle was already there when I arrived. He was standing in the hallway outside my grandfather's room with a cup of coffee he wasn't drinking, and when he saw me come through the double doors with my carry-on still over my shoulder, something moved across his face. Not relief, not grief. Something else, something that at the time I filed away without understanding. I should have understood it then. My grandfather had built everything himself. He grew up in rural Georgia, the son of a sharecropper, and by the time he was 60, he owned 3 commercial properties in Savannah and a piece of land in the North Carolina mountains that had been in the family since before either of us was born. He wasn't flashy about it. He drove the same truck for 11 years. He wore the same brand of boots. But the money was real, and everyone in the family knew it. What most of the family didn't know, what I didn't know until he told me himself, 2 weeks before he died, was that he had updated his will. He told me on a Sunday afternoon. His nurse had stepped out. My uncle was supposedly getting lunch. My grandfather reached for my hand the way he used to when I was small, and he said, "Vivienne." That was my grandmother's name. He caught himself. "Sorry, you look so much like her sometimes." Then he squeezed my fingers and said, "I need you to know that the land is yours. The trust, the property in Savannah, all of it, it's yours." I had Malcolm update the documents last month. Malcolm was his attorney. Had been for 20 years. I didn't know what to say. I told him I didn't need it, that he should focus on getting stronger, the usual things you say when you don't want to face the fact that someone is telling you goodbye. He shook his head. He said, "Your uncle is going to make noise, he always does. But it's legal and it's done, and I need you to promise me you won't let him bully you out of it." I promised. My grandfather died 11 days later, on a Wednesday morning just after 6 a.m. I was in the chair beside his bed. I held his hand. I told him I loved him. He didn't speak at the end, but I think he heard me. The noise my uncle made started before the funeral was over. He pulled me aside at the reception. My grandfather's house, people everywhere with their paper plates and their casseroles. And he told me there had been some confusion about the estate documents, that Malcolm was reviewing everything, that I shouldn't worry because it would all get sorted out. His voice was calm and reasonable, and I remember thinking he sounded like someone reading from a script. 3 days after the funeral, Malcolm called me. He said there was a discrepancy in the filing, that a version of my grandfather's will that predated the update had somehow been submitted to the probate court, and that my uncle had already retained his own attorney. He said I needed to come in as soon as possible. I drove to Malcolm's office the next morning. On the way there, I got a flat tire on Route 17. I pulled over, called roadside assistance, waited 40 minutes on the shoulder in October air while cars blew past me. I was frustrated and cold, and I was running late. I called Malcolm's assistant to say I'd be delayed. I never made it to that meeting. A car pulled up behind mine while I was still waiting. I assumed it was the roadside service. I got out to wave them down. There were 2 men, and I didn't recognize either of them. And before I could say anything or process what was happening, one of them said my name, my full name, and then there was something cold pressed against the back of my arm, and the highway tilted sideways and went dark. I woke up in a room I didn't recognize. Small, wood-paneled walls. A single window with boards nailed across it, letting in thin strips of light. A cot. A space heater in the corner that clicked and hummed. A door with a padlock on the outside. I sat up too fast and my head swam and I grabbed the edge of the cot and just breathed until the room stopped spinning. My phone was gone. My purse was gone. I had my clothes and my shoes and nothing else. I want you to understand what it feels like to be in a room like that. People think fear is loud. They think it announces itself. But real fear is actually very quiet. It sits down next to you and it doesn't say anything. It just waits. I sat on that cot for what felt like an hour before I stood up and started examining the walls, the door, the window, the space heater, every corner of that room. Because the only alternative was to stop moving, and if I stopped moving, I was going to fall into something I might not come back from. I found a gap in the boards over the window, thin, barely 2 fingers wide but enough to see through. Outside was trees, a gravel driveway. The corner of what looked like another building maybe 40 yards away, somewhere rural, somewhere very far from Route 17. The door opened once a day. A man I'd never seen before brought food, sandwiches, bottled water, occasionally something hot in a styrofoam container, and left without speaking. I tried talking to him the first few times. He looked at the wall above my head like I was a piece of furniture. On the 4th day, I asked him where I was. He set down the food and left. On the 7th day, I asked him why. He paused in the doorway, just for a second, and then he said, very quietly, "It's not personal." And he locked the door behind him. Not personal. I sat with those 2 words for a long time, and slowly, over the following days, I started to think through everything I knew: the will, the updated documents, the convenient flat tire, the 2 men who had known my full name, my uncle's face in that hospital hallway, that look I hadn't understood. I understood it now. The trust my grandfather had established was substantial, closer to $4 million once you accounted for the property values, though I hadn't known the exact figure until Malcolm had mentioned it in our phone call. My grandfather had been careful and methodical for 60 years, and he had left almost all of it to me. And my uncle, who had spent 30 years waiting to inherit a piece of that, had decided he wasn't going to let a will get in his way. The question I kept coming back to was, how long was he planning to keep me here? The answer came on a Tuesday, about 3 weeks in. The man who brought my food had left a stack of old magazines on the cot, and inside one of them, folded in half, whether deliberately or by accident I will never know, was a newspaper. Local paper, about a week old. The headline that caught me had nothing to do with my grandfather's estate. It was a small article, bottom of the front page, about a missing woman. The woman was 24. The woman was last seen on Route 17 after reportedly experiencing car trouble. The woman was me. I sat on that cot and read the article 3 times. Family members are asking for any information, it said. But the family member quoted was my uncle. My uncle expressing his concern, his anguish, his hope that I would be found. He'd given an interview. There was a photo of him that I recognized from his company website. I put the newspaper down on the mattress and I looked at the boards over the window for a long time. He wasn't planning to let me go. This wasn't a holding pattern while he sorted out the legal situation. This was the plan. Keep me gone long enough for the court to sort through the estate in my absence, long enough for him to argue that I was missing and presumed dead, long enough for everything to transfer to the next surviving heir. Which was him. I thought about crying. I decided against it. Not because I was strong. I wasn't feeling particularly strong that afternoon, but because crying wasn't going to get me out of that room. I started paying attention to everything. The sounds outside. The rhythm of the man's visits, the way the light changed through the boards. I noticed that the building I could see from the gap in the window had a light that came on at dusk and went off around 10. I noticed that on some mornings there were 2 vehicles on the gravel and on others only 1. I noticed that the boards over the window were nailed from the outside, but the nails on the lower left corner had started to rust and the wood around them had softened from moisture. I worked on those boards for 9 days using the metal edge of a broken spiral notebook spine I found under the mattress, a little at a time. At night, when the light from the other building was off and the property was quiet. It was slow, painful work that left my fingers raw and sometimes bleeding. And more than once I stopped and just pressed my forehead against the wall and told myself to keep going. On the 10th night, the lower board came free. The window itself was painted shut, but the seal had cracked with age. I pushed it open slowly, an inch at a time, my whole body braced for the sound of someone moving outside. Nothing. Cold air came through the gap. October had turned into November while I wasn't paying attention. I went out the window feet first and dropped onto frozen grass. I ran. I ran for what I later estimated was 2 miles before I hit a paved road. My shoes weren't made for running. My lungs hurt and my legs hurt, and every shadow in the trees looked like a person. But I ran until I saw headlights, and I stepped into the road and waved my arms, and a woman in a pickup truck stopped and looked at me through her windshield for a long moment before she unlocked the doors. Her name was Beverly. No, I'm sorry, not Beverly. I've been asked not to use her name. She knows who she is. She pulled over and she let me in, and she didn't ask a lot of questions, which is exactly what I needed. She drove me to the nearest police station, which was 37 miles away in a town I'd never heard of. I walked inside. I told the officer at the desk my name. He looked at me like he'd seen a ghost, because as far as the county sheriff's office was concerned, I was one. There is a specific kind of disorientation that comes from finding out the world moved on while you were gone. I had been missing for 41 days. In that time, my uncle had spoken to 3 local news outlets, organized a search that, according to the sheriff, had been called off 2 weeks prior, and filed paperwork with the probate court claiming that as the sole remaining adult relative, he should be appointed administrator of my grandfather's estate pending resolution of the missing persons case. Malcolm, my grandfather's attorney, had been trying to contest it. He was the one who had flagged that the will on file with the court was an older version. He was the one who had kept calling my phone, which my uncle's people had presumably destroyed, and leaving messages that I would never receive. He was the one, I learned later, who had called the FBI. Not the local police, the FBI, because Malcolm, who had known my grandfather for 20 years and had updated that will himself, had looked at the timeline and the paperwork and the convenient disappearance and concluded that this was not a family dispute. This was a crime. The FBI agent who came to the police station that night, I'll call her Agent Harmon, though that's not her name, sat down across from me in a conference room with a cup of coffee and a legal pad, and she listened to everything I told her without interrupting. When I finished, she asked me to describe the building where I'd been held, the room, the man who brought the food, the vehicles on the gravel. She wrote everything down. She didn't tell me I was wrong about my uncle. She didn't tell me I was right either. She just wrote it down. Then she said, "We've been looking for you." I don't know why those 4 words undid me when everything else hadn't. But I sat there in that conference room with a paper cup in my hands, and I cried for the first time in 41 days. Not loudly. I wasn't raised to cry loudly. Just quiet tears that I couldn't stop, and Agent Harmon didn't make it awkward. She just let me have the moment and refilled my coffee without being asked. My uncle was arrested 9 days later. I wasn't there when it happened. I was staying with a friend in Charleston. My apartment in Portland felt too far away. I wasn't ready to be that far from what was happening, and I got the call at 7 in the morning while I was standing in her kitchen in borrowed sweatpants. Agent Harmon. She told me they had him in custody, that they had also arrested the 2 men who had taken me off Route 17, and that they had located the property where I'd been held, which turned out to be a hunting cabin that my uncle had been leasing under a false name since August. Since August, 2 months before my grandfather died. He had started planning this while my grandfather was still alive. I sat down on my friend's kitchen floor when she told me that. Not dramatically. I just sat down because my legs decided they were done for the moment. The legal process that followed was not fast. I want to be honest about that because I think people expect justice to be quick, and it isn't. and that gap between the arrest and the resolution is its own kind of endurance. My uncle's attorney tried 3 different angles. He tried to argue that I had left voluntarily, that the flat tire was a coincidence, and I had staged my own disappearance for reasons related to the estate dispute. He tried to argue that my grandfather's updated will was invalid due to cognitive decline. He tried, at one point, to argue that the men who had taken me were acting without my uncle's knowledge or direction. The jury took 6 hours. My uncle was convicted on charges of conspiracy to commit kidnapping, obstruction of justice, and fraud. He is currently serving an 18-year sentence. The 2 men who carried out the abduction received lesser sentences in exchange for their testimony, which is the part that still sits uneasily with me if I think about it too long. They are out there somewhere, and I try not to think about it too long. The probate court, once the criminal case was resolved, recognized my grandfather's updated will. Malcolm had kept the original signed copy in his office the entire time, along with documentation of the revision process and my grandfather's signature verified by 2 witnesses. The older version that my uncle had submitted to the court was ruled fraudulent. The land is mine. The properties are mine. I didn't sell anything. I'm not sure I ever will. I go back to Savannah sometimes. I walk through the rooms of my grandfather's house, which I've kept more or less as he left it. The boots by the back door, the photograph of my grandmother on the kitchen windowsill, the coffee maker that still produces coffee that is probably too strong. I sit on his porch in the evening and I watch the light change over the yard, and I think about the promise I made him in that hospital room. I kept it. There are things I don't talk about much. The way I still check my car doors compulsively before I get in, even in familiar parking lots. The way certain sounds at night, the click of a space heater, specifically, will still bring me back to that room in a way that takes a minute to shake off. The way I spent a long time after everything was over being angry, not just at my uncle, but at the version of myself who had stood in that hospital hallway and filed away the look on his face without understanding it. I know that's not fair. I know I couldn't have known. I still feel it sometimes. What I do talk about is my grandfather, because I think he deserves to be remembered as more than a plot point in a story about what his son tried to do. He was a man who drove the same truck for 11 years and kept a photograph in his shirt pocket and told his granddaughter to drive in an empty church parking lot on a Saturday morning when she was 15 and terrified. He built what he built because he believed that what you leave behind matters. He was right. I never gave my uncle the satisfaction of asking him why, not at the trial, not in any of the communications that went through attorneys after. I don't need the answer. I already know it. It was the money, and it was the years of feeling passed over, and it was the particular kind of smallness that convinces some people that someone else's inheritance is something they're owed. That smallness is his to carry. I have other things to carry. Bigger ones and lighter ones. I still have the notebook spine. I kept it. It sits in a small dish on my desk next to my keys, and most days I don't look at it. But some days I pick it up and hold it for a second, and I remember what it felt like to work on those boards in the dark, an inch at a time, telling myself to keep going. I kept going. I still think about the moment I found my own name in that newspaper, a missing woman. Last seen on Route 17. That was me, reduced to 3 sentences and a photo my uncle had probably chosen himself. There is something specific about reading your own disappearance like it's a story that happened to someone else. And I think that moment, more than the locked door or the cold or the 41 nights on that cot, is what clarified everything for me about how the world actually works. My uncle believed that if he controlled the circumstances long enough, he could control the outcome. That's the logic of people who mistake opportunity for entitlement. He had spent decades watching my grandfather build something, and somewhere along the way he convinced himself that proximity to that effort was the same as deserving the result. It wasn't. It never is. What my grandfather built came from something my uncle never developed, the willingness to do the right thing even when no one was watching. to be honest in small transactions, because honesty in small things is the only thing that makes you trustworthy in large ones. My grandfather kept his word. He updated that will because he believed in doing things correctly, and he told his attorney, and he told me, and he signed his name in front of witnesses. That integrity is what ultimately protected me even after he was gone. You can't forge a character. You can only forge a document, and documents get examined. I thought a lot about what kept me functional in that room. It wasn't courage. I want to be clear about that, because I think people romanticize survival in a way that isn't useful. I wasn't brave. I was just paying attention. I noticed the rust on the lower nails. I noticed the pattern of the lights. I noticed that the man who brought my food paused for just a second when I asked him why. Paying attention is a skill, and it's one I'd been practicing my whole life without knowing it mattered. My grandfather modeled it. He noticed things, remembered things, kept records, stayed organized. Malcolm noticed that the will on file didn't match the one he had prepared. Agent Harmon noticed details in my account that I thought were too small to matter. The people who helped me were the people who were paying attention. Clarity of mind in a hard situation is not a gift. It's something you build quietly, over time, in ordinary moments that don't feel like preparation. And then there's the part I find hardest to talk about, which is the 9 nights of working on those boards. An inch at a time. Fingers raw. Stopping and starting. There were moments when I was completely convinced it wasn't going to work, that I was wasting the only energy I had on something that would get me nowhere. I kept going anyway. Not because I was sure, because stopping felt worse than failing. That distinction matters more than people realize. You don't have to believe something will work. You just have to keep moving through the uncertainty rather than letting it make the decision for you. My grandfather built $4 million worth of something starting from nothing. My uncle tried to take it in 41 days and failed. The math of that tells you everything you need to know about what actually lasts. I kept the notebook spine. It sits on my desk. Some mornings I look at it and some mornings I don't. But I know it's there, and I know what it cost me to use it, and that's enough.